My name is Sophie, I am 28 years old, and I am a writer. I live in Lyon with Thomas, my partner of 5 years. Our life was comfortable, stable, and seemingly enviable. Thomas is an engineer, a dedicated and methodical man. Our daily lives were dictated by our respective routines. He left early in the morning for his demanding job, while I stayed at home immersed in my manuscripts and imaginary worlds. But behind this facade of normality, there was a growing emotional void. Lyon, with its cobblestone streets and its blend of tradition and modernity, was the perfect setting for a fulfilling life. However, I felt a growing frustration inside me. Thomas was often absent, not only physically but also emotionally. Our conversations were becoming increasingly rare and superficial, and I found myself eagerly waiting for the rare moments when he wasn't absorbed by his professional projects. It was in this context that I started receiving numerous packages. Books, writing materials, everything I needed to nurture my creativity. Each delivery was made by Lucas, our young 24-year-old mailman. At first, it was just simple courtesies. Hello, thank you, have a nice day. But quickly, these trivial interactions evolved. Lucas had that charming smile, that engaging way of looking you in the eye as if you were the most important person in the world at that precise moment. I still remember the day when everything changed. It was a sunny morning. I had just received a big package of books I had ordered. Lucas, dressed in his blue uniform, had stopped a little longer than usual. "You must really love reading," he said with a mischievous smile. I laughed, a little embarrassed but flattered by his interest. From that moment on, every delivery became a moment I eagerly awaited. Little by little, our conversations deepened. We talked about literature, our respective lives, our dreams, and our frustrations. Lucas was passionate and enthusiastic, bringing a freshness that was sorely missing in my life. He seemed so different from Thomas, so present, so attentive. These stolen moments from routine became indispensable escapes for my mental balance. Then came the day when our exchanges were no longer limited to the front door. Lucas invited me for a coffee just to chat. I accepted, driven by a curiosity and excitement I hadn't felt in a long time. Sitting on the terrace of a small café in Lyon, we talked for hours as if time had stopped. It was the beginning of a growing complicity, a friendship that, I felt, was taking a dangerous turn. Each encounter with Lucas made me forget a little more Thomas's absence. I felt alive, desired, inspired. My creativity, which I thought was lost, came back with new strength. I wrote pages and pages of passionate and intense stories, reflections of what I was experiencing internally. But with this literary rebirth came also a growing guilt. The line between innocence and infidelity was thin, and I felt I was dangerously close to it. Yet every time I saw Lucas, I pushed my moral limits a little further. Thomas, absorbed by his work, noticed nothing. Our house, once a sanctuary of our love, became the theater of my inner dilemmas. One evening, while Thomas was working late, Lucas came to deliver a package. Our eyes met, and without a word, we both knew that something had changed. We crossed the threshold, our bodies irresistibly drawn to each other. It was the beginning of an intense and passionate affair, a secret burdened with consequences that we would have to bear. The affair with Lucas quickly took a more intense turn. We met regularly, first in secret places, then more and more often at my place when Thomas was absent. Each encounter was an explosion of passion, an escape from the monotony of my daily life. Lucas had this youthful energy, this zest for life that made me vibrate. He made me feel alive again, a sensation I had almost forgotten. Our moments together were stolen from time, filled with desire and complicity. We shared laughs, confessions, stolen kisses in secluded corners of the city. Each meeting was a risk, but it was precisely this danger that made our escapades so thrilling. Lucas made me feel desired, loved in a way I had never felt with Thomas. Our relationship was a mixture of guilty pleasure and intense happiness. Lyon became our secret playground. We explored the hidden corners of the city, from the alleys of Lyon to the banks of the Rhône where we sat to talk about our dreams and fears. Lucas, with his overflowing enthusiasm, told me about his aspirations and ambitions, making me forget for a moment the guilt that was gnawing at me. Each rendezvous was a breath of fresh air in an otherwise suffocating life. However, despite all this passion, a part of me knew it couldn't last. Reality always caught up with us. Every return home, every look from Thomas overwhelmed me with guilt. Thomas, faithful and loving, didn't deserve this betrayal. He had always been there for me, even though lately his work absorbed him completely. I felt torn between two worlds, the excitement and novelty of my affair with Lucas and the stability and love of Thomas. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Thomas came home earlier than expected. Lucas was still there in our bedroom, and the shock of the situation froze me. Fortunately, Lucas managed to slip out of the house unnoticed, but the incident left me trembling. The fear of losing Thomas, of losing everything, began to eat me from the inside. Yet the idea of ending my relationship with Lucas was unbearable. Every day became a dangerous game of lies and concealment. Thomas, though occupied with his work, began to notice changes in my behavior. He became more attentive, more present, undoubtedly trying to repair what he perceived as a rift in our relationship. But it was already too late. My heart and body were caught in a whirlwind of passion I could no longer control. Lucas, on his side, became increasingly attached to me. He talked about future projects, about what we could do together if we were free to live our love openly. But every time he mentioned this possibility, I felt a deep anxiety. The idea of leaving Thomas, of breaking our shared life, terrified me. I loved Thomas despite everything, and the idea of hurting him made me sick. One day, while we were walking in a park, Lucas held my hand a little longer than usual. His gaze was serious, almost imploring. "Sophie, how much longer are we going to live like this? I love you and I want to be with you for real. Don't you think it's time to make a choice?" His question echoed inside me, confronting me with the reality of our situation. I knew he was right, but the idea of choosing was unbearable. That evening, while Thomas was working late, I found myself alone in our living room, a glass of wine in hand. My thoughts wandered, torturing me with doubts and regrets. Lucas, Thomas, my life, my choices, everything seemed to blend into an emotional chaos. The truth was, I no longer knew where I belonged or what I really wanted. My heart was torn between two loves, two lives, and I knew that at some point, I would have to face the consequences of my actions. The days passed, and the weight of my double life became increasingly difficult to bear. The lies piled up, and every time I met Thomas's gaze, guilt overwhelmed me. Yet I couldn't bring myself to end my affair with Lucas. He had become an essential part of my life, a breath of fresh air in an otherwise suffocating world. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed increasingly concerned. He had noticed the many packages I was receiving, and although I told him they were writing materials, I sensed he wasn't entirely convinced. One evening, he confronted me, his gaze serious and worried. "Sophie, I feel like something is wrong. You are distant, and I can't understand why. Are you hiding something from me?" His question hit me like a punch. I felt vulnerable, trapped by my own lies. But before I could answer, Thomas continued. "I hired a private detective to understand what was happening. I wanted to make sure everything was okay with you. Today, I received his report." My heart stopped for a moment. Fear engulfed me as Thomas pulled an envelope from his bag. "What's this?" I asked, my voice trembling. He placed the envelope on the table, his hands clenched in anger. "Read it, Sophie." With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and took out the documents. It was a detailed report of my meetings with Lucas, photos, descriptions of our rendezvous. Every word, every image was damning evidence of my betrayal. Tears began to flow down my cheeks as I read the report. Thomas stood before me, silent, waiting for an explanation. "I'm sorry," I murmured, unable to find the words to justify my actions. "I didn't want to hurt you." Thomas shook his head, pain and anger mixing in his eyes. "Why, Sophie? Why did you do this to me? I have always loved you, always supported you. How could you?" The confrontation was inevitable, and I knew I could no longer hide the truth. "I felt alone, Thomas. You were always caught up in your work, and I felt like I no longer existed for you. Lucas, he made me feel alive again." Thomas looked away, his fists clenching. "You should have talked to me, Sophie. We could have fixed things. But now I don't know if I can forgive you." His words were like sharp blades, each phrase wounding me a little more. The following days were a whirlwind of confusion and pain. Thomas and I lived under the same roof, but it was as if a chasm separated us. He was distant, almost cold, and every interaction was tinged with tension. Lucas, on the other hand, continued to send me messages, worried about me, but I couldn't respond. I needed time to understand what I really wanted. Then came the day when Thomas made a decision. "I'm going to leave for a few days," he told me, his tone calm but determined. "I need to think about all this away from here. Take this time to think too, Sophie. Think about what you really want." His departure left me alone to face my demons. The days passed in a fog of reflection and doubt. Lucas, always present in my thoughts, missed me terribly. But I knew I had to make a choice, and that choice would determine the rest of my life. The days Thomas was gone were some of the longest of my life. I was alone in our apartment, trying to understand what I really wanted. My thoughts oscillated between Thomas and Lucas, two men I loved in different ways. One represented stability and the past, the other passion and novelty. Each moment spent alone confronted me with the reality of my choices and their consequences. One evening, while I was looking out the window, my phone rang. It was Lucas. Hesitant, I answered. "Sophie, how are you? I'm worried about you." His voice was soft, comforting. I'm fine," I lied, unable to tell him the truth. "Thomas has left for a few days. He needs time to think." Lucas sighed. "And you, Sophie? What do you really want? We can't continue like this forever. I love you and I want to be with you, but I don't want to force you to make a choice you'll regret." His words were filled with sincerity and pain. I knew he was right, but the decision was far from simple. The following days were a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. I recalled every moment spent with Thomas, every instant shared with Lucas. The idea of losing one or the other tore me apart. But I knew that at some point, I would have to face reality and make a choice. Thomas returned one evening, tired but determined. "Sophie, we need to talk." We sat in the living room, and he began to speak, his tone calm but resolute. "I've thought about all this. I love you, Sophie, and I want us to overcome this together. But I can't do it alone. I want you to end your relationship with Lucas. If you still love me, if you want to save our relationship, you have to do it." His words were like a dagger. The reality of what I had to do hit me hard. I knew I had to talk to Lucas, end our affair, but the idea of losing him hurt terribly. Yet I also knew that I couldn't continue living in lies. I met Lucas in a cafe, our cafe. His eyes lit up when he saw me, but he quickly understood that something was wrong. "Sophie, what's going on?" I took a deep breath, gathering all my courage. "Lucas, I have to end our relationship. Thomas wants us to try to save our marriage, and I owe him that. I'm sorry, but I can't continue like this." The shock and pain in his eyes were almost unbearable. "Sophie, I love you. But I understand. Do what you think is right." His words, filled with sadness, broke my heart. We parted in silence, each carrying with us the memory of what could have been. Lucas, unable to accept the end of our relationship, decided to reveal our story to the public. He contacted a journalist and recounted our affair in detail, hoping to force Sophie to leave Thomas. When the article was published, it caused a real scandal. My writing career was in jeopardy, and I had to face public anger and harsh criticism. Despite his efforts to rebuild our relationship, Thomas was deeply hurt by this public exposure of our private life. The following days were filled with tension and reconciliation. Thomas and I began to slowly but surely rebuild our relationship. There was still a lot of pain and anger to overcome, but we were determined to make it. Each day was a new step towards healing, a new chance to regain what we had lost. Lucas, on the other hand, had disappeared from my life. I avoided the places where we had met, trying to focus on my writing and my relationship with Thomas. But he remained always in a corner of my mind, a constant reminder of what I had sacrificed to try to save my marriage. One morning, while flipping through an old notebook, I came across a quote I had written a long time ago: "Love is not a choice between two people but a choice between truth and lies." These words took on new meaning for me. I had lied to Thomas, to Lucas, and to myself. Now it was time to live in the truth, no matter how painful. Thomas and I decided to go to couples therapy to help us overcome this ordeal. The sessions were difficult, but they allowed us to open up to each other, to share our fears, regrets, and hopes. Little by little, we began to rebuild broken trust, rediscovering the reasons we had fallen in love with each other. One evening, while we were having dinner together, Thomas took my hand. "Sophie, I know it hasn't been easy, but I want you to know that I love you. I'm ready to do whatever it takes for us to overcome this together." His words, filled with sincerity and determination, gave me hope that we could really make it. As for Lucas, he would always be a part of me, a painful but precious memory. He had taught me things about myself, about what I wanted and needed. But life goes on, and it was time for me to turn the page and focus on the future. Through this ordeal, I learned that infidelity is never a solution but rather a symptom of deeper problems. I learned the importance of communication, honesty, and forgiveness. And above all, I learned that true love requires sacrifices and compromises, but it is always worth fighting for what we believe in. My story with Lucas would remain etched in my memory, a chapter of my life that I would never forget. But today, I was determined to write new chapters, chapters of healing, growth, and renewed love with Thomas. Because deep down, despite all the mistakes and betrayals, true love is the one that survives the storms and comes out stronger on the other side.